Okay.
Got it. All right.
Okay, cool. So welcome back to Talking Therapy. My name is Devraj, and I'm very excited today to have on the channel from the other side of the world from me, in fact, from Golden, Colorado, Mr. Mike Gavers, who's a transpersonal psychologist and a men's coach and a generally very interesting and intriguing chap. So welcome, Mike. Thank you for coming on the show. And yeah, I mean, how would you like to introduce yourself and your work and your interests and your specialities?
Oh, goodness. Well, thank you. Privileged to be here, or happy to be here. Um, I guess what I would say is that I grew up uh, focused on becoming an engineer, went to school to be an engineer, got a degree in chemical engineering, worked in the corporate world for a dozen years, and sort of burned out and tired on that whole thing and switched careers altogether, become a psychotherapist. And then after so many years of doing that, I decided I had kind of buried my engineering past and there was a lot to offer and I wanted to revive that. And so slowly kind of integrated men's coaching and working with a lot of engineers. My original intention was to help engineers move into entrepreneurship. And as my business has kind of evolved, what it's looked more like is helping small business owners. Usually their business goes through like a step function increase in growth and they're pretty overwhelmed. And I kind of help them sort through that transition. But I work on relationships and all kinds of things, just kind of through networking around with clients. But also been married for over 25 years, have two teenage boys, and I'm active in kind of a men's organization that's international called the Mankind Project. And but also very active in this kind of Robert Anton Wilson community. I'm now hosting a podcast for his publisher where we're covering all of his major influences. We have a podcast on Reich, which will release next week on the 23rd of October. There'll be a second episode. And I've written a lot for that community lately on the 8 circuit model of consciousness that was big with Robert Anton Wilson, but originally developed by Timothy Leary. So that's kind of the short, long introduction, maybe.
Cool. So, yeah, I mean, how would you kind of because I'm someone who doesn't know so much, I'm into psychology and certain strands of psychology, particularly working with the body and the Reiki and stuff. But I've heard of Robert Anton Wilson. He's always seemed like a kind of intriguing character, but I have yet to read any of his books and stuff. How would you introduce his work to someone like me, probably similar to other people watching this channel, and his contribution to therapy or society in general?
Oh, yeah. So Robert Anton Wilson, I would say the easiest way to get to know him is a book, Cosmic Trigger, that he wrote, which is semi-autobiographical. He's a man of many ideas, and so he introduces a lot of ideas in there, and you kind of get a gist for what he's about. I think that he proposed 2 major things. One, he popularized Timothy Leary's 8 circuit model. So he's really well known for that because he really took it. And he wrote a book called Prometheus Rising, which for psychologists is maybe a better place to start. Mm-hmm. And that's really all about the 8 circuit model and comparing it to other psychological models and philosophies and things, and kind of showing how it works by drawing all these comparisons and providing exercises that introduce you to the model. And the other thing, which I find harder to explain, and there's really a lot of depth to it, is what's kind of been coined as maybe logic. And I think the general idea we could say is that humans tend towards binary thinking, I think, by nature. You could maybe say that's a function of the brain, and neurons are like circuits and they're either on or off, and maybe that predisposes us to binary thinking. But nonetheless, I think most of us would agree with enough study that most everything in nature occurs across a spectrum. And so it's really maybe logic is about thinking in terms of probabilities and spectrum. So it's not like this is true, but maybe there's an 80% chance this is true based on the knowledge I have now. And the deeper you go into that, you really get into this kind of neurological relativity where we all see things from a different perspective. And then, we all have a very subjective nature. And then you get into what is objective truth. It really is a pretty deep rabbit hole to go into, but on the surface, there's a lot of just critical thinking and thinking in terms of probabilities and not necessarily yes or no, but maybe. So thus maybe logic. And if you're predisposed to fiction for Robert Anton Wilson, I would recommend Mass of the Illuminati is one of his fiction novels. That's probably a good way to kind of dip your toe in a fun little novel that exposes a lot of concepts. So yeah.
Cool. Well, I will check. I'll check those out. I'll check those out, particularly for fiction. I like a bit of reading fiction, certainly. And I mean, it seems to me that he attracted quite a following, and they're quite radical in their thinking. They're guys who are into all sorts of possibly what one might consider out there kind of theories, and they're evaluating that stuff and looking at different possibilities rationally, as opposed to kind of being in this fight or flight mode, kind of I need to really know what's going on and control everything and keep it simple kind of thing. Would that be kind of accurate, or in some way, like description of Wilson?
Yeah, he boy, I lost my train of thought there. Could you rephrase your question again real quickly?
Yeah. I mean, I was just saying, he seems to me, from my limited perspective on him, he attracts quite a lot of free thinkers and people, maybe with some experience or whatever, and who are open to a variety of theories and looking at them objectively.
Right. I think what and maybe logic boils down to is that we all are really heavily constrained by beliefs that we're not even aware of, and so unconscious beliefs. He called them belief systems, or BS. And that's really limiting our thinking. So a lot of his writing is really trying to shake you out of your preconceived notions that you're not even aware of. And he kind of uses very clever techniques of shock and surprise, and almost like a comedian that, slips in little things under the radar. And so in that regard, he really, opens you up to other ideas and maybe flips the script on things just to try to get you to expand your thinking. And we can ask, how much of that did he really believe in or not? And he would like to say, I believe in nothing, or I don't believe in anything. And that's a whole nother rabbit hole. But certainly he introduced a lot of alternative perspectives and tried to create just an era of more open-minded thinking.
Cool. And I recall, when we spoke a little bit earlier, that you yourself had developed some of his, I think they're originally Tim Leary's ideas around this 8th circuit model of consciousness. And perhaps you could just explain that a little bit to a layperson or newcomer, someone who doesn't know so much about it.
Sure. I'll back up and just give you an example. When I came to Robert Anton Wilson through Timothy Leary, and back in the late 90s, there was a great website called deoxy.org that explored a lot of these psychedelic thinkers like Alan Watts and John Lilly and Timothy Leary. And Timothy Leary's page and Robert Anton Wilson's page were one at the time. They shared a page on his website. And so I didn't know who this guy was, but on his, Robert Anton Wilson, 1932 to never. And that, like his date, born and died. And then you click on never was a link, and it talked about immortality. And he was promoting immortality as a thing we could achieve in our lifetime. And I just couldn't wrap my head around that at the time. And it was just one of those, I don't know if I can handle this guy. These ideas are too weird kind of thing when I first encountered. But that was, again, a way of his just kind of to shock you into new ways of thinking. And so, yeah, he promoted this model, the 8th circuit model of consciousness that Timothy Leary developed. And I think one way to think about this is, well, for Timothy, Dr. Leary, he was a model maker. He was a brilliant psychologist before he discovered psychedelics. And I always wonder what his impact on the field would be if he just kind of stayed in that mainstream lane, because he was I read his most recent book before psychedelics, and it was written in the 50s, and it just blew my mind. The interpersonal diagnosis of personality, just really brilliant and way ahead of its time for mainstream psychology. But he was always modeling things. And I think as soon as he encountered psychedelics, he started modeling them, like, what the heck is this? And what are all these new experiences of consciousness? And so he was always tinkering with this, how to conceptualize all these layers of consciousness. And at the end of the day, what he came up with is this 8-circuit model. And on its core level, it's really Freudian. To be frank, it's, there's 4 level base layers of consciousness, which are, Freud's oral, anal, phallic, and sexual. And he skips latency. And what you find there is it's really kind of a brilliant thing, because during latency, it is latent. Freud was a neuroscientist, and he knew there was actually no brain development going on during that period. So he very correctly named that the latency phase, which is from about 5 years old to puberty. But from conception to 5 years old, the brain goes through this explosion of growth. And you can see phases of development. Anybody who's raised children or been around children sees these developmental stages, but you can basically boil them down into like the infant, the toddler, and the preschooler, let's call it. And then, we have the latency phase, and then there's what Freud called the sexual stage, but we just call it adolescence, right? And Freud had his psychosexual lens, and then another gentleman, Erickson, came along later and basically remapped the same thing a little differently with a psychosocial lens. And Leary just kind of had that, took that model and saw that there was 4 different kind of versions of consciousness that came through these developmental stages. And then what he saw after that is there was expanded states of consciousness, which we call the upper circuits or the higher circuits. And so that might be just kind of, if anybody smoke marijuana is kind of familiar with this kind of bliss that you get, this somatic high that you get from marijuana, which is more or less that hedonic 5th stage. And then you start getting into kind of deeper stages of feeling and sensing with psychedelics, to where maybe your nervous system is attuned to things on a higher level. We might call that full sensory perception, but people that can see things like psychic powers, which is getting a little out there, but just being able to intuition at a base level is kind of this 6th circuit of consciousness, where you're just tuned into a different level of sensing and feeling. And then the 7th circuit is more this feeling of interconnectedness with the world, the sense of unity. And then the 8th circuit is more impermanence. It's this non-local, beyond space and time, kind of disembodied state of consciousness we might call quantum consciousness, which is just kind of like going from the 7th circuit, where you feel connected to everything, to feeling one with everything, to kind of dissolving into that and losing all ego and being just one with the universe, to where there's no identity at all, beyond space and time. And a lot of the arguments are kind of like everything else, this all happens at a spectrum, and where do you draw the lines between 7th and 8th? And there's a lot of discussion about that. But so that's how I see the model in a nutshell. We kind of take on these imprints, we would call them, for the first 4 states of consciousness. And that usually you might look at it as like incomplete work to be integrated based on kind of an incomplete imprint. But part of that imprint is just our very nature. But how can we integrate those imprints and change them? Leary was very much into reality change, like, who do you want to be this time around? And I think part of that was Leary just had this incredibly flexible personality, and that was kind of, he could literally, like a chameleon, morph like that. I don't know if the rest of us are necessarily built that way, and I think sometimes it's more about becoming who we are more fully and integrating things rather than complete personality change. But anyway, the idea is we kind of get these crystallized imprints at birth, and that we can integrate them and develop them, and then we can access these higher states of consciousness, and there's a relationship between them. And this model just struck me, and I worked with it for 10 years before I moved my career from engineering to psychotherapy. And when I was in psychotherapy school, everything I was learning, I found that like psychology, it was just a mess. Everybody had different ideas. There's the behaviorists and the cognitive behaviorists and humanists, and it's like, oh my God. But I all eventually was able to hang it on this model and make sense of the world. And this model kind of emerged as something that held a lot of values, like a meta model for me. But it was just really dated. If you read Prometheus Rising, you'll just see it was written in the 80s, and it was his kind of PhD thesis at an alternative university. But it's kind of quirky and dated, and there's just so much we've learned since then about neuroscience. And to be quite honest, I don't know that I agree with some of Wilson's take on contemporary psychology. So I really wanted to just update this model based on the way I saw psychology, developmental psychology. It also, you can look at evolutionary psychology, has kind of the same developmental progression, and there's a relationship, and Jung's work apparently was a lot about that. And so I started writing about that, but a lot of my training is embodiment and relationship. And we have a guy that came after Wilson, Anton, that kind of brought embodiment to the model. He was kind of an experimental theater guy, and he brought his experimental theater practices into the model and how to utilize it. But my bias is also just so heavily relational. And I think, people try to say, where does relationship fit in this model? And you might say, oh, the second circuit or the fourth circuit. But to me, it's all relational. So I also wrote a paper just kind of framing this model from a relational perspective. And these papers are pretty dense, and they're made for people that are already familiar with the model. So, my next step is to start kind of creating something that anybody can pick up. I think we're going through a massive transition in our global consciousness and our global politics and economy and everything. And I think this model is useful for making sense of the world, making sense of ourselves in this time of transition. We're seeing a growing increase in psychedelic psychotherapy and psychedelic experimentation, for that matter. And this model can really help make sense of experiences that there's not a lot of models out there to help you make sense of it. And as I say all this, at the end of the day, what I would say is that all models are flawed and some are useful. The map is not the territory. So we have to just kind of also, learn that there's limitations, and that this is a great tool for diagnostics and assessment. But at the end of the day, you can get lost thinking about this model, especially a heady guy like me, and that it's really more about how do we bring this work into practice.
Interesting. Thank you for that. Thank you, Mike. A few things you said really it intrigues me, particularly around this kind of shift that we seem to be undergoing, or, some people would say we're undergoing, and the kind of increasing polarization that's kind of going on attitudinally, and people generally struggling to really make sense of, in a kind of, in the old style, rational kind of way, when maybe there were just, 20, 30 years ago, when there's like 3 or 4 TV channels and a couple of newspapers, and that was the truth, and it was kind of easy, you could be skeptical, but it was like one kind of voice of authority coming to you. And now, of course, there's a multitude of news channels, and it's created a situation where it's by no means easy to necessarily make sense of what is currently happening in the world with COVID, with unrelated climate change and all sorts of issues. And there's this immense polarization that's happening. Do you think that this eighth circuit model, as it's been developed and as you've developed it, is that useful in that kind of context, in the context that we're moving through? And if so, what do you think it would say about it? Or yeah.
Well, I think you're right. I have a big shtick about change right now, and I think you're right on a global perspective for climate and the planet and our role with the planet. There's a massive shift like never before. You could say we're now. We used to always, as humans, be dependent on the planet, but now I think what we're learning is that we're interdependent. The planet depends on us just as much as we depend on it, and that's unlike anything in the 4 or 5 billion year history, whatever it is, history of the planet. And we're also going through a transition. I think this is first detailed in Alvin Toffler's book, The Third Wave, a long time ago, but we moved from hunter-gatherer to agricultural to industrial to now technological.
Mm.
And in addition, and political economically, the United States is on the decline, and China is on the rise. And so we're looking at a shift of global economic superpowers that happens once a lifetime. And so I think we just, everything we've used to make sense of the world up till now isn't going to work anymore.
Mm.
And it really, I would say we just throw it in the trash, but human nature isn't like that. And we need something to replace it with. So yes, I love your question was, does the 8-circuit model help with this? I think the 8-circuit model is a multidimensional map of consciousness that helps us make sense of human experience. And it helps us understand that at a base level, there's a part of us that's an infant that only cares about safety and security. And that at a second level, there's a kind of this toddler that is concerned about status and what is mine and what is not, and who am I and where do I end and where does the other person begin, and what is this sense of self that comes from boundaries and emotions and all this wonderful things in toddlerhood. And those two things really, in my opinion, drive the ship. When I'm a psychotherapist, those are the perspectives I'm assessing my client at, what's going on. Their story that they're telling me is a third thing. And I'm listening to that, but it's really more coming through nonverbal stuff that I'm assessing these other things that really, I think, are driving the ship and shaping the narrative this person is giving me in their story. And I don't know that people realize this, that we're just driven unconsciously. A popular podcast out here is Joe Rogan, and Joe Rogan gets baffled by scientists because he thinks that they should be rational and the facts should just kind of drive the ship. But scientists have egos and insecurities just like the rest of us, and they cling to their ideas and they fight for them. And it's like, they're just humans like the rest of us. And so when you think, we talk about this polarity, I totally agree. I think what we're seeing is played out over and over in these long-term debt cycles with the rise and fall of superpowers. And what happens is you get a gap between the haves and the have-nots, and then the people on the bottom, the have-nots, we get polarized because we both have different ideas on how to solve this problem. So we fight each other instead of looking at the people above. I'm going off on a tangent. The 8-circuit model, I think it just provides a map to understand human consciousness and human behavior. And when you pair that with maybe logic, you can start to apply that to this polarity and say, what's the middle ground here? What's the maybe? How can I understand your perspective? How can I understand your perspective? And we're not, it's this common thing. When you have polarity, you have to rise to a higher level of consciousness and synthesize the two sides to come to a resolution. Mm-hmm. It's not like we're just going to decide one of you are right and one of you are wrong. We're going to have to, the polarity is going to have to reach such a tension that the whole thing breaks down and we raise to a higher level of consciousness with a new solution. Mm-hmm. And I think that when you start looking at this 8-circuit model, it can provide some maps to make sense of all that. And it is just one of many models. That's a great question. Like, what do we need? What is the totality of it? But maybe logic and 8-circuit model, I think, can really help us make sense of the world and make sense of ourselves. If we looked at the polarity, we might have people that are very individualistic in their thoughts. I want to do what I want. I don't want to wear a mask. I don't want to take the vaccine. And other people that are very community oriented, we got to do this for herd immunity and it's for the good of the community and we want to help everybody. And I think they're both right. What does it take to be an individual in a community? Yes, I'm a sovereign individual, but I'm also in the context of a community here. I think when I really ask your question, how can we apply the 8-circuit model to the current predicament? I think it's a way to make sense of our irrational behaviors and our limiting beliefs, and we could come to this higher state of consciousness by realizing that we have much more potential and we have unconscious limits, mm-hmm. and how to become aware of that and integrate that and work with that.
Mm-hmm. Mm. Yeah, interesting. Thank you, Mike. I mean, like knowing, you're a guy who's researched people like Leary and Wilson quite extensively, I'm just kind of intrigued. What do you think they would make of like October 2021 in the US? What would, do you have an idea what would Wilson's reaction be to it, or Timothy Leary's like take on it all, or how would he behave, or this kind of thing? Sorry to suddenly jump this question on you.
No, these are big questions, and sometimes it takes me a while to digest, and so I'll walk away unsatisfied with my answers, and like a month later, I'll have it all ironed out. But that's what fascinates me is these folks like Leary and Wilson and another gentleman, Terence McKenna.
Mm-hmm.
They really spoke about the internet as expanding consciousness, and that suddenly you're exposed to a variety of opinions. I remember when I first showed my wife search engines, and I pulled up like Yahoo and maybe Alta Vista, and
Mm-hmm.
she searched Shih Tzu, our dog,
Mm-hmm.
and the top 10 search results for Yahoo and the top 10 search results for Alta Vista were all shuffled and different because there was different algorithms, and she was like pissed off, like they should be the same. and that's so the point being that the internet gives you it's a perspective, not an absolute truth, and you really have to learn how to sort it out, and you're exposed to cultures all over the world. And I think these guys felt like it was going to force us into critical thinking, and then they've all left us, and now what we're left with here today is like the opposite of critical thinking. Everybody's siloed in their own little echo chamber, and it's the complete opposite. And so it hasn't really panned out like we all hoped it would. I think it will eventually, and I think it's going to rely on money, but that's a different story. But how would they say today? Well, today they're going to see these echo chambers, and I don't know what they would say. In my own opinion, I think it's happening so fast that people aren't ready for it. And it's like we were saying earlier, we all have these structures and beliefs, and it's so innate to us that we don't really realize how innate it is. And now everything is changing, and all the old stuff doesn't work, and we have to find new things. And it's changing so fast. I think people are retreating to these echo chambers of social media to find safety, to find, oh my God, this is people that agree with me, and this is like safe. This is like everything else is uncertain in the world. I can't make any sense of it. Everything that used to make sense no longer makes sense. But if I retreat into this echo chamber, it makes sense to me, and that creates safety. I think personally, we're just beginning with the internet. It's Amazon is done its thing, and it, like it or not, it's changed the world. But I think that's just like the first step. I'm going to pause because these big questions, my mind goes all kinds of places, and I want to make sure I'm still answering your questions, because my next thing is to go into Bitcoin, but that's a whole nother wrap. So I'll throw it back to you, just check in with you, because I've kind of lost my train of thought.
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah. I mean, I was just kind of intrigued, what would Tim Leary suddenly just rocking down in California today and catching up with what's happening, or the same with Robert Anton Wilson, who left us 10, 15 years ago or something like that. I'm not sure.
Yeah, about 15 years ago. Leary was 25 years ago. I mean, they're both optimists, I think, at heart. So they would be putting out a story that's optimistic despite all the chaos. Boy, I would have loved to see Robert Anton Wilson do some raps about Donald Trump. That would be something else.
What do you think his take on Donald Trump would have been?
Oh, he would have torn him to pieces.
Oh.
Yeah. I mean, he was very anti-authoritarian, but he tended to be more anti-Republican than Democrat. And I think he would have just had a lot to say, but it would have been a lot of the same things he's already said, because it's just kind of the tyranny of government. I think they would basically be saying the same things, but we'd have to create a rap about the current social media echo chamber. And my rap about that is that just the change is happening so fast, the world isn't ready. And if you really studied maybe logic and really kind of, what's the Alan Watts book, The Wisdom of Uncertainty? He used to recommend that. Probably a good book for all of us today, because it's just where we're at. Nothing makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I would be interested to see, I got, obviously with both of them, the explosion of research in psychedelic therapy. And what, they would be very optimistic about that, while at the same time decrying that the government is just getting in the way, making it difficult still, even though it is advancing.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. It's hard for me to put myself in their shoes, I guess, at this point. I'm trying to kind of formulate my own perspectives these days, where I used to really just kind of take on their perspectives as a young adult. Now I'm really more interested in developing my own, but using some of their models.
I mean, one of the, well, I think that was great. Thank you. And interesting. And I guess one of my own kind of developed understandings from working as a therapist for a while, and with a body in the kind of heavier end of therapy and emotional expression, is that it's kind of like there are certain bugs in the human brain, but leave it kind of, in the same way, I'm not a computer scientist, obviously, but like certain computer systems are open to being hacked in a certain way and hijacked and used for nefarious purposes. The human brain is a kind of similar, and there are kind of ways in, and then you can kind of control human behavior in a way that the person probably, if they were sitting rationally, would not agree with. When although we have this highly developed kind of neocortex and this massive capacity to think, if our nervous system is kind of triggered into a threat situation, then like you say, we're just running towards anything that feels safe, and in that state, of course, we can be corralled and kind of urged into perhaps not a very good direction, and that this is one kind of bug almost in the human brain. And on another level, what I see quite often is, although we are consciously aware of what's happening, there are also kind of subliminal, subconscious circuits operating that are constantly monitoring our environment for stress triggers. And so, we may often be in defensive behavior before we're even actually aware of it. And I've been working a lot with dissociation, which essentially is my take on Reich's schizoid personality, the idea that when triggered in a certain way and a certain feeling of unsafety is registered unconsciously, that the attention just comes right up into the mind, and we just go in this kind of super thinking world and shut off everything else. And I don't know, I also don't know exactly what I'm saying here, but I'm just aware that it's kind of easy to manipulate humans, and we've kind of come to a place where, with Facebook and Google and the level of AI that they now have kind of assessing, our attentional behavior, how we place attention has left them potentially in a position where it's relatively easy to manipulate our voting behavior or some of our behaviors, not necessarily that the organizations are malevolent in some way, but it's just actually quite easy because there are these kind of security vulnerabilities within human brain architecture, and a lot of what's going on now is kind of exploiting that in a sense, or that there certainly is a kind of exploitation going on somewhere. I don't know. That's just something I'm kind of aware of, and I think what I've been learning and trying to practice myself more is that, my need to make sense of the world is also in a way it's in a relationship with the degree to which I can feel my body. And And like if I can feel my body more, I am more okay with a world that I can't really make sense of, you know, because it's like I mean, just for example, living here in Kiev and you know, and hardly speak about 1 month into my Russian course and not doing very much and really not speaking the language and not knowing many people and whatever, I can still feel pretty okay as long as I have this kind of this connection to my belly, this feeling of my legs, you know, and this kind of thing on a deep level. It's like my life becomes kind of simple in a way. I'm just busy with daily stuff that I have and kind of satisfied with that in many ways. And I don't know in the long term, but I don't know. And that is the kind of thing, you know, having been very dissociated in my time, you know, coming back into the body, I see that our need to make sense, or my need to make sense is somewhat less the more present I am inside of my body and the more I can feel my body basically. And from that, it makes me, I'm not so triggered by, I have been very triggered by things in the last couple of years, but I'm not so triggered, or where it seems to wear off quite a lot quicker. And then I can try and distinguish rationally what's going on, even when there's a sort of myriad of voices from social media, government or whatever, kind of trying to push me into one of two camps, you know.
Mm.
Do you relate to stuff like that at all? Or you were saying like you've got your own take kind of what's going on in the world and it's not so easy to look through the eyes of people you studied anymore. And what's your feeling about all of this?
Well, and I do, as you were telling me all that, the 8-circuit model was running through my head, and where I feel like there's that rational third circuit thinking part of ourselves that thinks we understand, thinks we're free-willed, you know, autonomous humans. And nonetheless, it's these lower impulses and urges that are really driving the ship. And so what, you know, when we're just in our head running on this rational part, it can get really, we're not really connected to reality, to be frank. I mean, that's part of disassociation, right? It's just kind of a disconnect from reality. And there's, the thoughts don't really have any rootedness, you know. It's like I'm creating models of things and stories in my head, but they're not grounded in reality. But when I get into my body and my emotions and my feelings, then I'm more in touch with reality. And then my thoughts can kind of shape themselves around my experience. And that's kind of what I was hearing you say, you know, that first circuit is that infant that just craves safety. Mm-hmm. And the second circuit is that emotional part of us that really, if the first circuit in the extreme negative is terror, you know, fear and terror, and the second circuit at its extreme negative is like deep shame. And to me, that's that deep shame that's really dissociative. And so, yeah, by getting in touch with our body and the felt senses that come from it is a way to get into reality in the present moment. You know, the body is always in the present moment. So we're tuning into that, we're becoming present, we're feeling our sensations, we're getting, that's feedback from the world, right? You know, that's our body's feedback to us about how it's interacting with the world. Mm-hmm. And then, you know, so it makes sense to me that then once you do that, your mind is going to be a little calmer, maybe not as unhinged or you know, creating stories of fear and uncertainty and shame, but like, oh, if I tune into the world, it's really not, you know, or maybe it is unsafe because of what, you know, your environment, but at least you're tuned into it and you can, you know, create a story that's congruent with the environment versus just making stuff up. Mm-hmm. Does that land for you and what you were?
Yeah.
Just kind of reframing what I heard you say.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah.
And then, yeah.
How do you see the world of October 2021 and all what's going on in America? I mean, I haven't super been keeping track in the last month, but I heard like the president was like talking about, you know, if you haven't got the vaccine, you're gonna lose a job and this kind of thing, and the whole sort of turmoil that people are going through. Do you think it's like it's kind of a necessary kind of rite de passage kind of thing that we just somewhere individually or as humans have to go through? That seems like
I'm not, so are you talking about like vaccine mandates and things like, and mass management?
I don't mean like the specifics. I mean, it can be specific, but not necessarily the
Right.
specifics, but just the way that we're being, almost pushed into kind of really primal conflicts and having to take a position, either agreeing with authority or kind of for either because we do agree with it or because we're afraid of it or because of, or pushing against it and kind of, fighting and more like the kind of the deep psychology of it. And is this a kind of necessary, almost like a tunnel we have to walk down as people? I don't know. It's like a scary place that we need to be in. I don't.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the first thing that comes up for me is like, it's getting harder and harder to sit in the middle. Um, I feel like that's where I want to be, and I tend to drift one way, but not necessarily agree with that because everything's become so extreme. It does feel harder and harder to sit in the middle. But what you're saying, I think, ties back to what I was saying earlier. I think we are on the precipice of a mass transformation. I think it's so, I thought, oh, the internet gives us Amazon and the world's going to be neater, but I think that's just a glimpse that the future is going to be completely unrecognizable, perhaps.
Mm-hmm.
And part of that shift into a higher state of consciousness or a new state of consciousness is that we're going to have this polarity, and it's going to have to increase in tension until it just gets so tense that it has to resolve itself.
Mm-hmm.
Hopefully we don't exterminate ourselves in the process, but I don't honestly think that's, I don't subscribe to the doomsday theories. It always seems like we're about to crater off the edge of a cliff, but we always manage to pull through. It could be pretty messy, but I think it's just, if you're asking, is this a necessary step? I would say, yes, it is. That unfortunately, in order to move into a different state of being, we're going to have a big shift, and that shift comes through a polarity that the tension is going to build until it finally breaks down and resolves itself.
Mm-hmm. So you think like it'll hopefully will there won't be a civil war basically in the States or in Europe and that kind of thing, and people just somewhere come to a place where we can recognize that we're all human, or that we can coalesce around certain values, or even I guess something I kind of pick up is like there's a kind of, I mean, I guess one of the ways I see it is that, especially being British, and Britain originally gave a lot into the sort of foundation of the United States, was this kind of idea of institutions, and that you have institutional structure that kind of maintains power, and essentially controls how information is gathered, in terms of, say, for example, scientific research, and how information is distributed, outwards. So it's, these kind of institutional power structures have been running, for several hundred years in places like the UK, and particularly in America, which is a very, very powerful country these days, and certainly for quite a while. And I kind of see it, but we're in this kind of phase where, I don't know, the institutions are kind of kicking back in some way, or they're just trying to, like, I don't remember Star Wars very well, but was it like I don't know, when they're under threat, these kind of old power bases, they just go on the offensive in one last kind of push to ram the old narratives back into everyone's mind and get everybody back under control or something. And like, I don't know, that's a little bit how I kind of, I don't know if that's something you relate to, but that's a little bit how I kind of process what's going on. There's these big old institutions in science, and commerce, and they're just pounding the same stuff back out, and they're really just putting everything into it, because I guess they perceive there's been a slow decline in their power over the last 20 years or so. And like, if we don't push back now, we're going to be slowly, our power base is going to be eroded away little by little or something like that.
Yeah, I think that's natural. The institution is going to want to naturally maintain, if not expand, its power, and it's just doing, and it sees that things are shifting, and it's probably doesn't even realize, if the institution had a consciousness, I would say on an unconscious level, it knows that it's being threatened and it's clinging and and doing whatever it can to hold on to whatever it can while it can. You bring up a lot of interesting points, civil war. I'm hopeful we don't have a guns and bullets kind of war, but we're at that point in history.
Mm.
The conflict between the US and China is going to revolve around Taiwan, and that could well lead to a guns and bullets type of war, although I don't know, maybe warfare is also fought more on the internet these days as well. I don't know it's not my category, but and if the United States continues to decline, I could see it breaking up. I don't know if that would be a civil war, but I could see it kind of fragmenting.
Wow.
I mean, this is, again, if you look at these big transitions, I think if we're just looking at the long-term debt cycles and these once-in-a-lifetime global shifts of power, I think if the trend continued, it would be a no-brainer. The United States is going to try to inflate away its debt that it's piling up rapidly, and it's going to collapse and fall from the global power, and then the China will rise and take the seat, and the world will restructure its institutions around China and will continue to march along. But
you say that, Mike, but I mean, I don't know. I have a okay.
Well, yeah. What I'm saying that if history repeated as it has,
Okay.
but I think that there's three cycles converging in my mind. One, the climate planetary, I don't know if it's a cycle necessarily, but it's a huge shift. Two is the global economic once-in-a-lifetime debt cycle. And three is this shift from industrial to technological. So because this transition is happening from US to China is not a transition yet, it's just an uncertainty, is happening at the same time we're shifting from industrial to technological, I think it's going to shake out differently. That's what I would say. And because we have this added pressure of climate change and all that, that's driving us to kind of think as a community, a global community. We're going to have to start thinking in those terms, whether everybody wants it or not. They're going to get dragged kicking and screaming into that. And we're also shifting technologically, and I think that is going to disrupt the pattern. And I don't know that it'll be China as a superpower, the US as a superpower, but I think maybe a combination of and this all revolves around money. So I'm going to bring it into the play, but we have United States and the dollar, the euro and the European Union, and maybe the pound, whatever the hell's going on there. And then, the Chinese yuan, but the currency of the future, the currency of the internet is Bitcoin.
Mm-hmm.
And I know I feel like, how do you know if somebody's vegan? They'll tell you. How do you know somebody's a Bitcoiner? They'll tell you. I don't want to be too evangelical, but I've really come to believe in this technology. And I believe that it is going to, that really money is so innate to our consciousness, we don't realize it, but this shift in how we view money and this shift from industrial nation states to internet and Bitcoin is going to change our consciousness, because Bitcoin is decentralized. So you're talking about civil war and institutions are holding on to power, but we're having this like dispersion and decentralization,
Mm-hmm.
and that's going to show up in the money.
Mm-hmm.
And what blew my mind about this is talking about Bitcoin. The guy's like, so if I have gold and you want my gold, you rob me, kill me, take my gold, we invade your country, we steal your gold. But if I have Bitcoin and it's encrypted and the password's in my head and you kill me, nothing, no money, no Bitcoin. So it incentivizes you to negotiate. I mean, think about that. Think about that for a second. If the world changes from a place of dominance and submission, where I want your gold, I take it, and that's where wars and nation states are all founded on, to an economic system that revolves around negotiation, that's a total game changer. That's a shift in consciousness that's massive. And the currency is all supported by this decentralized system that has it's just based on math. It's I don't know. I think that technology is going to completely change everything. I don't know how we got on this subject. We're talking about but
Okay, it's okay. I used to run a cryptocurrency YouTube channel for a while, actually, a few years.
oh wow.
But I kind of dropped it because it wasn't really in my heart, and being a therapist was more kind of in my core, and there were so many fucking scammers, and I mean it was
Yeah.
I mean, Bitcoin's of course different historically, but like because where it's
But
coming
it's like the same scene, it's kind of hard to talk about because there's so much stigma. It's like the psychedelic scene. It's hard to talk about because there's so much stigma.
Stigma, yeah, there's stigma. But yeah. I mean, all I was going to just say when I was kind of interrupting you a little bit before was like, I mean, living here in Ukraine, it's like I meet a lot of people fleeing China at the moment because they, they've been living there 4 or 5 years working away, but they're not Chinese, and China, I mean, Xi is going into, like, as I see it, a huge defensive reaction right now. A huge defensive reaction. So I don't know, when people tell me China's going to take over, I'm a little bit, and I'm not an expert political analyst, I'm a little bit skeptical of that. It's like it's a huge contraction of power where, the death of Mao, then you had this other guy, Deng Xiaoping, who kind of manipulated his way to power. I've met Chinese who've been in the CCP, and they say, we knew full well back in the 80s that there was no way that China could survive as a communist organization except for the fact that it was embedded in a global free market, because we could create a lot of very cheap goods, and Deng Xiaoping created special economic zones to do this. Without that, communism would have collapsed, the same as it did in Russia, through starvation, because there's a certain point where if people don't get enough of their most basic needs, they just aren't going to put up with the political system anymore. And, in the same way that it kind of happened in Russia, it would have happened in China, but for the fact that, after Mao, Deng Xiaoping manipulated his way to power, or was pushed a little bit, and he kind of opened up to the capitalist West. And that's what's been supporting China for the last 20, 30, 40 years. I don't know how true that is, but that is from, people who are Chinese and who've worked in the park I met. And so they were kind of just giving me that's the real lowdown, and now kind of Shiva, has been in power for a few years. He's like rolling all that stuff back and just going into this huge kind of defensive reaction, and at the same time kind of saber rattling about Taiwan. But I don't know that China's in such a powerful position, really.
I hear criticisms like that, and I get it, but I think if you look at the big picture, the simple fact is the Chinese economy is, I don't know where it's at in the list, but if it's not number one, it's number two, and it's shooting up rapidly.
Yeah.
And that's what's, at the end of the day, that's what's driving the whole deal. It's the economy. I get that there, you make a lot of valid points, but at the end of the day, if the economy is strong and continues to grow, it's going to do its thing.
I mean, I guess so. And I guess my mind just thinks that, well, yeah, as long as we're still in this kind of global free market, okay. But if that's starting to break up with the collapse of the state, whatever, then maybe that puts a bit of a different slant on everything, and I guess at the end of the day, if China want Taiwan back, in a sense, because it was kind of Chiang Kai-shek and all this kind of thing in history, just as Putin wants Ukraine back. Every week, Putin's making some veiled statement. Yeah. I'm coming back in here and I'm getting Ukraine back, and like, if Ukraine and China join NATO and this kind of thing, and Putin's like, if you even start to let the Ukraine premier into a discussion about NATO, I'm coming down on these guys like a ton of bricks, So it's like, these are like, they're bits that these countries used to own for quite a long time, and for a brief period are no longer under their control, Ukraine and Taiwan, and they want it back. But I don't know that means that Putin's going to be marching into Berlin anytime soon, or even Warsaw, or the Chinese are going to be coming into Bangkok, but So in terms of physical expansionism, I don't really see it, but that could provoke some kind of, huge standoff conflict. But yeah, economically, who knows? I mean, I'm also fascinated by Bitcoin and the fact that it's just kind of, arisen 12, 13 years ago, and, almost like by some computer game, but a few kind of computer nerds were playing, and now now it's worth like $61,000 or whatever when I saw it earlier today. And the fact that the institutions, financial institutions in particular, they're kind of they're saber rattling against it and stuff like that. And I know the WEF are getting ready to they're kind of busy with, particularly in Russia, there's a lot of, and the Ukraine is a kind of center of computer hacking and ransomware attacks, so, and ransomware attacks, you hijack some countries' kind of infrastructure or their health service infrastructure, computer infrastructure, and you demand, 100 Bitcoin to give it back, because they're not asking for currency, of course, because that would be a drag for them to have to organize all that, or gold, they want Bitcoin. So the WF want to lay into Bitcoin. There's quite a few other kind of bits of America, and the Chinese are laying into Bitcoin, but like, it's still standing, and it's still worth $60,000, it's like, it's pretty, that's pretty incredible as well, I mean.
Yeah, there's a lot of rabbit holes to go down with Bitcoin. Maybe an infinite number, I'm learning, but I think it's certainly legitimate and here to stay, and a big threat to the dollar and the yuan, and thus it's interesting to see how it all shakes out. I mean, back to China, I would say economically, they're on the tail end of their short-term business cycle, debt cycle. So, the Evergrande thing and things like that are kind of going to emerge as we have these 5 to 10 year short-term debt bubbles in all the major countries, and they're on kind of the tail end where they're going to be kind of on a downslope in the short term. But in the long term, their economy is growing, and they're becoming the big kid on the block, and that's undeniable. And everybody says these, the currency is backed by guns, and when they talk about currency and Bitcoin and things like that, or just superpowers are backed by guns, but guns aren't free. They come from money, and money comes from a strong economy. And so I don't agree with the Chinese policies, and maybe I think their economic system is largely misunderstood from what I can tell from the people I'm reading. The guy that read on this is Ray Dalio, and he has a book coming out next month. He's been releasing this book one chapter at a time, and the whole book's coming out next month, called The Changing World Order. And it's based on
hedge fund manager guy. What's his?
Correct. Bridgewater and Associates. He started studying the long-term debt cycles, and he wrote a book about that that's very generally based. And this new book is really applying it to the US, China, and our current situation. And he speaks with authority on this. I don't give him authority. I can tell he knows what he's talking about. And he says, China isn't interested in taking over the world, but they do have a one China policy, which was bringing Hong Kong and Taiwan back in the fold. And that's where the rub is right now. He thinks the conflict between the US and China will center around Taiwan, which is basically true.
Yep.
And I don't agree with their the Muslim population, the way they treat that. I don't agree with a lot of their policies. I know the way they're manipulating their capital markets with lately is shying away from a lot of innovation investment. And so they're maybe shooting themselves in the foot in that regard. But again, if you look at the economy and the big picture, as long as that economy keeps growing and they become the largest economy in the world, everybody's forced to do trade with them. And that's whether like it or not, that's what matters. But again, I think the world is changing in so many ways that it's not just going to be China as the boss, for the next 100 years. It's going to be more dispersed. And that's, again, like where Bitcoin becomes, as we shift more and more economy onto the internet, and Bitcoin is the currency of the internet, it's going to change. That's the whole concept. Anyway, yeah. I don't know if we're here to talk. We should talk Reiki and therapy at some point.
Yeah. Look where it goes to. But I guess like also, in a certain way, America, like a lot of civilizations, has thrived in an environment where there's a coherent external threat, because that can be a forcing or galvanizing function that brings a culture together, and of course this was even tribal, of course, if there's an external threat, you're less likely to have a civil war, because it's quite clear to you on a deep primal level that we need to work together to deal with this thing, guys, and so maybe that'll be a kind of positive thing if there's it kind of really is perceived, or actually is, a genuine threat to world order.
That's interesting. Well, and what occurs to me as you say that is really that I think the United States has a leg up on innovation and technology. Yeah. And that's really what's emerging. And that will, maybe I'm saying this selfishly as American, but it will keep us relevant.
Yeah. I mean, America is like, I was like, I was a 20-year-old, I was super anti-authoritarian, hippie, punk dropout, and very anti-American, but I don't know, it's just because I'm getting old and a bit different, but like, I'm pretty pro-America these days, Jesus, it's like, yeah, I see a lot of people in this kind of American culture war all raging about stuff and that, but like, if you talk to some people just on the street here in Kiev, about that stuff, and they're like, these, their take on the culture was that people are just so wealthy, they've got nothing better to do than bitch about shit,
Probably
they're,
right.
they're busy just trying to fucking survive and get their needs met, and the reality is that the overwhelming majority of the world's population live in very simple authoritarian regimes. It's as simple as that. China, Russia, Africa, outside of the EU and I'd say North America, basically we're looking at very simple, primal authoritarian regimes where there's a gang of people at the top, and pretty early on that you don't challenge power or something bad is going to happen to you, and it's as simple as that. And the reality is that what defines the Western countries is that they're not like that, and that is actually a relatively small amount of the global population, under 10%.
Yeah,
we need those guys, or we're just going back into, you got a gang of Putin types just running the whole show. I don't know. I mean, it's like. It's like we need America to be coherent, because the EU is kind of, I don't know, it's doing its thing, and Britain is unlikely to be a giant superpower anymore. We need America to kind of come through this and start to lead the world again, in a better fashion, and really get out there and show people how it can be done. I think that's
right.
necessary,
No, what I hear is you're saying all that is, if given a choice between, having the 800-pound gorilla on the street be the United States or China, most people are going to choose the United States.
Yeah.
Maybe unless you're in Southeast Asia, and just because of proximity, you'd rather be aligned with China. But and then my hope would be that through the internet and the currency of the internet, that we see more decentralization and less power in the hands of the nation states. And maybe that means ultimately we don't have a top dog. I don't know. It's going to be different.
It's going to be different, man. It's going to be different. I want to stay alive long enough to witness a good level of the change. That actually motivates me in some of my health goals and stuff like that.
I think it's, so just to continue on this wrap, I follow an investment firm that specializes in innovative technology, and they're very public about their research, ARC Investments. And they talk about, they see 5 domains of change: electrification and battery technology, automation, artificial intelligence, blockchain technologies, and genomics. And the thing is, they feel like these technologies are right on the edge of maturity to where they're going to be cost efficient. And so, we're talking in 3 to 10 years, we're going to see massive political economic shifts. We're going to see massive technological shifts, and I hate to say climate shifts. I hope not, but the world's going to be different, and these technologies are going to really disrupt everything. They're thinking automated cars are right around the corner, and the automation and artificial intelligence and with cars is going to, they believe, take oil demand, which they believe peaked last year and will never see peak 2019 levels at 100 and some odd barrels, whatever. It's going to drop to 80, 20% decline in global oil consumption in a few years due to automation of cars and electrification. It's mind-boggling.
Absolutely. I mean, what do you think about Elon Musk and like Neuralink and stuff like that? Where
Yeah, wow.
I mean,
the guy's got like 4 companies that are completely, 4 or 5. You talk about Tesla, SpaceX. SpaceX is launching these telecommunications satellites. I forgot what he calls his internet satellites, but then you've got Neuralink and the Boring Company, and it just, I can't even wrap my head around Neuralink. I could talk about Tesla a little easier.
I find that stuff fascinating because it's like, I mean, we're going on a little bit here, but like,
I've got time.
Okay. Like, I guess what's fascinating is, I followed for a while this whole kind of, in science for a while, about 10, 15 years ago, that this idea that, the brain is creating consciousness, essentially was a kind of dominant position, a materialist or physicalist view of consciousness, and so the scientists have been, investigating, and this was like the last frontier. They'd worked out how a lot of the modules of the brain were kind of creating thinking and whatever, and perspectives and analyzing stuff. But, what was it that actually, on a material level, distinguished, a part of the brain where we're consciously aware of something and one where there's processing going on, but we're not consciously aware of it. And I think sometime around 2010, it reached a kind of zenith, where 99% of people in science basically believed that consciousness was a material phenomena, and we were just around the kind of corner from, some huge revelation of, okay, this is the consciousness module 3 inches in from here, to 10, 12 years down the line, and maybe it's not materialist actually, because and so that kind of intrigues me when I think about Elon Musk and Neuralink, and he's kind of, you drill like a 12 millimeter hole in the head, and through the skull, and you put this kind of Bluetooth thing in there, and you attach it to a few, and they're going to be experimenting soon with guys who've got, severe cognitive or physical dysfunction to help them overcome that. But of course, as Elon Musk very honestly says, that of course, we're going to be supporting people who've got injuries to start with because they want to try the technology, but we'll be moving on to like, okay, how can we create a kind of interface where the brain interfaces with computers? And then the underlying question for me is it, or I see our culture somewhere kind of trying to unravel, can we shift consciousness to machines, actual consciousness? And actually, is there even, is our whole perspective on consciousness right or wrong? Is the, these kind of philosophical zombie old arguments, Dan Dennett and Dave Chalmers and these kinds of guys, so I've been following a bit of that here and there, and I just find it intriguing, that we're doing this stuff now, and we're really, I think in the world, I mean, generally, we're at a point where, even though humans are quite reserved and kind of, we like to hold on to the past and everything, we're being forced to jump, we're being forced to jump somewhere, into a different reality, whether we want to or not. And this is a chunk of it as well, can, what really is conscious experience and all of that kind of thing, I find that stuff also fascinating, and so that's my tie-in for Elon Musk, where he's researching this. It's like, okay.
Yeah, that's one where I just have to sit with the mystery, see how it all unfolds.
Yeah.
It's fascinating stuff. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, things intrigue me.
I've heard him talk about that Neuralink and how it works, and it's what was coming up for me while you were talking is that it is the unconscious mind. I hadn't really thought of this, but if the Neuralink can operate unconsciously, when we talk about the machines taking over, and if we're all plugged into the machines through this invisible thing in the back of our head where they can take over unconsciously, I try not to get wrapped up in those fantasies because I think they're a little silly about the machines gaining consciousness and taking over. But all of a sudden you got me with that one where I was like thinking of Neuralink and we're all hooked up.
Yeah, yeah.
What I do find interesting, particularly in our, with your theme in Reiki and psychotherapy and me strongly influenced by somatic psychotherapy is that consciousness is moving more and more online. And, my kids live on their phone to where it's an extension of them. And I think what's going to be important is, you can move into this online world, but we also need to move out of it and be embodied and relational in the physical world. And I think that's going to be important. And I don't know if it's a lost art. I don't know if it was discovered enough to be lost, but certainly something that needs to be. I think we're going to need more and more education on embodiment and relationship because we're moving in a direction of less and less embodiment and relationship through our electronic connections.
Absolutely. And I guess the only real hope for that is that especially with exacerbation in screen usage created by COVID and lockdowns and things, that we move into some kind of mental health crisis where actually the only economic way out is to teach embodiment practices, as opposed to kind of trying to use more drugs or whatever, which don't really work and addict people and stuff like that, here in the UK, you can get kind of prescribed mindfulness now. You can do
Wow.
doctor, if you've got, certain stress related or chronic pain conditions, they send you off to a sort of Kabat-Zinn trained practitioner, to teach you how to be mindful with chronic pain and this kind of thing. So, I'm kind of hopeful that, like you say very well, whether the knowledge ever really came enough out in the first place, or whether it's been kind of pushed back or suppressed or whatever, that embodiment practices can start to come in somehow. That would just be incredibly awesome to see, especially how the last kind of 30 years of our kind of psychological development has gone, with so much energy going into CBT and into, psychiatric medications and stuff. And yet they haven't really, despite all the brain research as well, really come up with any kind of meaningful solutions for, major mental health conditions like anxiety or depression. They're still pretty much in the dark, really, in a lot of ways.
Yeah, it's interesting. I haven't really been tuned into it for several years, but the cognitive behavioral therapists, the kind of the mainstream therapy, they started adding in mindfulness, and you had DBT and you had mindfulness-based cognitive therapy and all the little spin-offs there. And last I heard this was several years ago, that they were starting to incorporate embodiment into it. And I don't know where that stands, but the mainstream, I hate that term mainstream, but whatever, the mainstream view is slow to change.
Yeah.
And but it's changing, and it's going in the right direction. I think I don't have a lot of love for cognitive behavioral therapy, to be frank, but I think it's moving. Or if I were to categorize that, I would say that's a therapy for the third circuit. And it has its use, but it's like there's 7 other circuits we need to work on.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Cool. Hey, Mike. Well, it seems like a good point. So unless there's anything else you'd like to introduce, just to sort of wrap this session up, and I just want to appreciate you for coming on and just speaking so openly and putting your perspectives out, and going for it with all my kind of questions. Some are a bit rational, some are a bit crazy maybe or whatever, but like I'm kind of, I'm intrigued about all of this stuff, and it's been a pleasure to meet you and to listen to you speak. Thank you.
Oh, thanks. Yeah, I really enjoyed it. It was definitely more of a big picture conversation than I expected, but that's excellent. And so I don't have anything in closing other than MikeGathers.com. I do work as a men's coach and transpersonal psychologist, and I work online, so all over the world. And most of my clientele comes through my network, so my website isn't necessarily a great representation of all the different things I do, or
Mhm.
but well, I say that it is, but I'm wanting to expand that with some more blog posts so people have more of a sense. But certainly the information I've communicated here gives you an idea of how I think philosophically.
Mhm.
And I really enjoyed the conversation, Deb.
Yeah, yeah. Thank you. And yeah, men, we should get on. We're going to do another session sometime, so we should look a bit at men's issues. I think that would be really interesting.
Yeah, I'd love to. We could talk about men's issues and also maybe a little bit more of the mechanics of therapy and some, where the rubber hits the road.
Yeah,
But
yeah, yeah. Let's do that. Let's do that.
awesome.
Cool.